Well, welcome everybody. It's great to see everybody again this morning. Thank you for everybody that was with us last night or who drove through the night to get here for this morning's conversation. We had a good day yesterday. For those just arriving, we talked about the president's role within the executive branch, starting with a focus on OMB and then talking about the president's relationship to the agencies. We had a terrific night last night at UVA's Rotunda where we looked at 2 case studies of presidential leadership. And today we're now going to get to a really important question that ran through some of yesterday's conversations. It ran through all of the conversations actually yesterday, but we'll focus fully on it, which is the president's relationship with Congress. We'll have 2 panels. The first one will be broadly about the relationship, but particularly with a focus, if we can, on how presidents and Congress make budgets. It's one of the things that the Constitution gives the power of the purse to Congress, but obviously the president signs those things into law. So it's a shared and complicated relationship and one that's getting a lot of attention. And then after that, we'll focus on the president's use of emergency powers, which we also heard yesterday flows back into the budget conversation, because when a president declares an emergency, suddenly they think they can spend money on lots of things. And Congress may or may not have something to say about that. We'll see. And then we'll break and we'll have lunch. And then for those of us staying, tonight is the 50th anniversary celebration, and we're delighted for those who can stay with us. I'll turn it over now to the first panel, and our host is Mike Emanuel from Fox News. Mike is the chief Washington correspondent. He came to Fox News in Washington from the Fox affiliate in Austin, Texas, where he covered then Governor George W. Bush, jumped on the campaign plane, and then became White House correspondent. He has incredible experience, and he's a longstanding friend of the Miller Centers. And Mike, we're delighted to have you back. So Mike, please take it away.
Bill, thank you very much. Honored to be here. Congratulations on 50 years of excellence to the people here at the Miller Center. I look forward to seeing what you do with your next 50 years. We have a small but scrappy panel with some really smart people, so let's get after it. We're talking about Congress and the president. As we saw, Congress took a beating yesterday in some of the panels, and so we've got some experts here to break it all down. Alphabetically, Dan Meyer, Director of White House Leg Affairs, Bush 43 Administration, Chief of Staff to former Speaker Kevin McCarthy. He is a Miller Center Governing Council member. Sid Milkis, UVA Politics, White Burkett Miller Professor of Governance and Foreign Affairs, also affiliated here with the Miller Center. Louisa Terrell, Director of White House Office of Leg Affairs, the Biden administration. She is a Miller Center Senior Fellow. And Phil Wallach, American Enterprise Institute Senior Fellow. Welcome to all of you. So Sid, in terms of the growth...
Yes, Mike?
I'm caffeinated this morning. In terms of the growth of power of the presidency, you write that it's been happening for more than a century, going back to Wilson and Roosevelt. What's changed?
Since Wilson and Roosevelt, or yeah. Well, slowly but surely, we get the birth of the modern presidency during the progressive era, embodied by the administrations of Roosevelt and Wilson. But there's a reaction to that in the 1920s, a return to normalcy, as Warren Harding called it. And it's during the New Deal, which I think is really a critical turning point in American politics, that you have a consolidation of the executive power that represents the modern presidency. And by that I mean the president, rather than the Congress or political parties, becomes, as Theodore Roosevelt put it in a kind of a beguiling and somewhat disturbing phrase, the steward of the public welfare. Mm-hmm. And the New Deal not only advances power in the wake of these emergencies, the Great Depression, World War II, but the modern presidency is institutionalized, and we get what I call the organic statute of the modern presidency, the 1939 Executive Organization Act, which creates the White House office, the West Wing, and the executive office of the president. So now what Roosevelt does by charisma and personal and political talent, people like Harry Truman and Eisenhower can do institutionally. I mean, I can say a lot of nice things about Truman and Eisenhower. Charisma is not, is not something that they really exuded. Now, if I could just take a couple more minutes, there's not a lineal development from the New Deal to where we are now. Mm-hmm. The New Deal created an executive-centered administrative state. And so the administration of things becomes central, and lawmaking begins to become subordinate to administration. And I think there are three related things that cause that. I'll mention them quickly, and we can dig into these. One is there's a displacement of conflict. During the New Deal, the emphasis was on security, national security and economic security. And there was a strong consensus behind it. And so the presidency and the country was not really embedded in was not really agitated by polarization. In fact, if you from the end of World War II until the late 60s, you have a period which is the least partisan issue in American history. That changes in the late 60s because the displacement of conflict leads to a situation where these polarizing social issues, coming from the culture wars of the 60s, civil rights, sexual identity, immigration, law and order, the mobilization and counter-mobilization of really serious cultural change in American politics. Those issues are more polarizing. They're less subject to compromise. You can compromise over how much you should raise the age for Social Security. It's very difficult to compromise over reproductive rights or civil rights. And that leads to a situation of polarization, and Congress becomes kind of polarized by this whole hyperpartisanship. And both parties begin to look to the presidency, if I can use an analogy from Alexander the Great, to cut the Gordian knot of partisan gridlock and advance partisan causes. So I've mentioned two social issues, the looking to the president to cut the Gordian knot. The third thing, which I think is underemphasized, is that during the New Deal, you had one party that supported advancing the government, growing the government, and the other party, the Republican Party, to rolling it back, or at least keeping it from growing. What happens in the late 60s is conservatives come to the conclusion that coming out of these culture wars of the 60s, American politics has become, liberalism has so corrupted American politics, so denigrated it, that it's no longer enough to do nothing. Now it's time for Republicans to take affirmative action in defense of their values, and they do that in defense of national security, provocatively extended to homeland security. They do that with law and order, and they do that with civil rights by repurposing civil rights from the traditional causes of marginalized groups to things like religious conservative or anti-Semitism. The president head of the Division of Civil Rights, rather than talking about slowing down civil rights, as was the case with the Reagan and Bush administration, talks about a new paradigm whereby the Department of Justice has to take on new causes and which don't roll back government but expand. So what we have now is a battle for the services of the administrative state that was created during the New Deal.
All right. Bill, you write about LBJ's mentor in the Senate, Richard B. Russell of the great state of Georgia, who bristled about serving, when it was suggested he served under 6 presidents, that he preferred to say he served with 6 presidents. Today it feels like a lot of lawmakers are resolved to the fact that they serve under presidents. What about that?
They're pleased just to be in their presence. But I think the story that Sid just told, that I don't need to go over, has a lot to do with it. Power shifted to the presidency. That contributes to people's sense that legislators just aren't what they used to be. But something about the principle of geographic representation has also lost its juice over this century. That's coincident with the rise of the president-centered administrative state. I think that's partially because geography, I think, is much less important today. Contrary to what someone said yesterday, our country's become, because of mass communications and easy, cheap travel, much more intermixed. And for Richard Russell, he was a phenom in Georgia, elected Speaker of the House of Georgia as a very young man, governor of Georgia before he ever came to Congress. The idea that he could ever be anything other than a son of Georgia, the segregated state, the society that he came from, it was literally unthinkable to him. For all his presidential ambitions and the way his loyalty, for all the good and ill that it brought with it, he could never be anything other than a representative of the state of Georgia. And that creates a sense of true representation that brings a kind of legitimacy. I think as the parties nationalized and polarized and became more identifiable brands that get continuously redefined by the presidents largely, just the contribution of the individual legislators and their distinctive geographic constituencies is less important. This is a triumph of TR and Woodrow Wilson's vision of American politics as sort of a leader-driven mandate, right? Presidential elections become our way of seeking representation, and the problem is, of course, they just can't bear that much weight. We ask them to decide an insane number of matters once and for all, yes or no, who wins, and as a result, they drive the American people insane because we sense that these are such important events. So this is really this is what democracy has cashed out to for so many people. Who gets elected president? And every time Donald Trump feels the need to remind everybody, I got the most votes. He just keeps repeating that as if it solves all problems and should carry everything in its ahead of it. Unfortunately, that with that diminished importance of Congress, both in practice and in our political imaginations, we have a hard time understanding where there's any place for compromise and accommodation in our politics.
All right, Louisa and Dan, you are veterans of this conflict between White Houses and Capitol Hill. It is late September, so it's only a matter of time before we put on the screen Countdown to Government Shutdown. So at crunch time...
It could be up there already.
I haven't checked this morning. Louisa, what's it like when you're facing a deadline like this, interaction between the White House and the Hill?
Yeah, good morning, and it's
Morning.
nice to be here. Look, part of this is like a tactical piece that's starting to happen, right? And process-wise, and we saw Shalonda yesterday, who was sort of a master of this, is there's sort of two trains running at the same time. There is the appropriators, and they're sort of talking to each other, trying to figure things out between themselves. There's different subcommittees, and that work is happening. But then really what happens, there's the second train, which is really then leadership and the White House come into it. And I can argue there are sort of goods and bads of having this sort of two-tiered process. But really what's happening is they're sort of taking that piece and then saying it's sort of the politics come next after there's some back and forth with the appropriators. And I think, this sort of high stake piece that we see, I mean, I know Dan and I have lived through many like countdowns. What time is it going to go through the night? What are the memos that are going out to agencies to prepare? And I think at the end of the day, there has to be the political incentives and the wherewithal for that sort of final negotiation to happen between the White House and leadership and both sides. I've seen it where you have everybody's in the room together. I think here, part of the issue that I see that's different right now is, and Dan and I have talked about this a lot, is, both sides have to demonstrate to their constituents, their special interests, their base, that they have to fight really hard. And we're sort of used to that, and we've seen that, and you're trying to adjust. I think there's a new phase where not only do you have to fight, but you don't negotiate. And I think that's sort of a problematic place of where we are here. It's remarkable, right, that we're however many days, 10 days, a week away, and we're really in a posture where the issue is not to negotiate. And to me, that's different than we've been before, where it's been you should be fighting hard, but you can sort of fight in closed rooms and you can fight sort of out in the press. And now we're at a different stage where it's not to negotiate. And I think that's frustrating, right? Because there is this institutional memory and muscle that happens with appropriators, right? A long time ago, if you were a chief of staff, you'd fight like hell to make your boss get on the appropriations committee. I mean, that was the thing. Everything else was like, go do your little thesis class in other committees. But like, if you want to be the guy, go be on the appropriators. And I think, there's real, you're seeing this kind of diminishment of committee power. And particularly for appropriators, that's a real tension, right? There have diminished roles. And I guess I would add to that, I think overall, this way in which the centralization of power in Congress is around leadership and not around committees, I think that's part of feeding some of the issues that we're having already. But Dan, I don't know what you
I
or
agree
disagree.
100%. And I go back to two words you said, which is the political incentives. And right now we're in a moment in time where if you compromise to try to get something done, it's evidence you're not fighting hard enough. Yeah. And you're just going to get vilified. And the best example of that is Senator Schumer, who, my judgment, I'm Republican, but I'm trying to be objective. I thought he made the right decision in the spring for his side to cut that deal. Because, you look at what I'm reading the news today. That was what a lot of people anticipated might happen back then. And he just got attacked from his own people, and to the point where he can't compromise now. He's in a political corner by his own side, and that's happened on the Republican side multiple times too. I'm not trying to point a finger at Senator Schumer. That's what they're dealing with right now, and the whole, as Lisa alluded to, right now members of Congress, when they go home, and I know this happens on the Republican side, and my sense is, based on what I'm watching, it's happening on the Democratic side, is the question they get asked when they go meet with their, excuse me, Phil, or Sid.
You're waving the white flag.
I know, exactly.
I haven't gotten that far yet. It's a little early. No.
Congress is coming back. When they go home, the question they get asked by the people on their side is, are you fighting hard enough? Or more pointedly, you're not fighting hard enough. Right. And I heard this often in Republican conference meetings when rank and file members would get up at the microphone to address the leadership, saying, we have to fight harder, we have to fight harder. That's what my people are saying, we have to fight harder. And it's like, to what end? And again, if you compromise, it's evidence you're not fighting hard. It's self-defeating.
Clearly, the Founding Fathers did not intend for the government to be funded at 6-week continuing resolutions or 3-month continuing resolutions. So, Hill experts, how do we get back to normal budgeting? Dan, you want to take that one first?
Well, I think there's multiple reasons it broke down, in my judgment, but and Elise identified the problem. We're pretty much emasculating the Appropriations Committee, and she's right. Back when my early days, I worked for a senator who I thought, you had a chance to get on appropriations, how could you pass that up? And I worked for a House member who worked hard to did get on Appropriations Committee. It was the committee you wanted to be on, and now they are fighting almost every year to have relevance, and it's not, it's to the detriment of governance, to say the least. The regular order process broke down, I think, for a few reasons, but most recently, we still were passing appropriations bills, a few cycles ago, and I think we got into a situation where both sides started using the process, because these were must-pass bills, to load them up with your gotcha amendments. And so I know, there at one point when there were amendments about removing Confederate flags, and the Southerners and the Republicans said, we can't vote on that, we can't vote on that. And it's like, really? I'm from Minnesota. Like, you can't vote to not have Confederate flags. I didn't understand it at all, but it was a real sentiment, and they felt very strongly about it. So all of a sudden, and the other side too. Republicans did the same thing. And all of a sudden, it grinds to a halt. You can't, okay, maybe we can move the Veterans Affairs bill, that bill, but we can't move Commerce Justice because of all the social issue amendments. And that's one of the main reasons it broke down. And I don't know that, I think the way that gets fixed is there has to be there's one of two things that I think has to happen. One is there has to be some sort of an agreement, whether it's formal, some rules, or that we're going to find another way to have votes on those sorts of amendments. We're not going to use the appropriations process for that. Or you have to have a majority who's just got the courage to, okay, we'll explain away that these are ridiculously political votes, but that's easy to say and it's harder to do. But that used to be what happened when there was an occasional one of these. The majority would just tell the members, we have to vote this down, or we're not going to get anything done. And look at all these other things we want to get done. So we've lost that ability in the recent cycles.
Louisa, thoughts on budgeting?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Dan, right, that we have to pull out, like, the fights that you would have, like, both when I was in the Obama White House and Biden around riders, right, which are these things. I mean, it sucked up all the oxygen, and it was everybody going to their corners. And that became, when you were at that time when leadership in the White House are fighting, half the time you were doing that, you were really just talking about these political pieces that you were trying to extract from the process. So I agree. I do think, not to be super doomsday, I do think what's kind of interesting here is if, as we've discussed yesterday, there is an anti-institutionalism, an anti-establishment that's happening from both parties, right? Mm-hmm. This is on my side of the aisle as well. The problem then becomes you're fighting about something that people, like, more and more don't care that much about, don't feel the power of. So how do you get in this place where we're fighting about putting together a budget of a government that a lot of people think is kind of meh, right, inefficient, don't feel like it's serving people anymore. You're defending it, right? You're in this kind of Doge place a little bit. That hurts. That's harder for my side of the aisle, right? Democrats have kind of come in and said over and over again that we sort of believe in government. And that's not to say that Republicans don't believe in government. We have a different idea around sort of how it wraps around in our families and our communities. So I do think this strain of anti-institutionalism pushback is making some of this harder to have the debate and come to a landing point. It's more sort of what's in the water. Tactically, there are things around committee rules that you could do, get rid of riders. You could do things like, I mean, look, I know this is terrible, but I kind of like earmarks. I don't know. Like, I'd throw those back into it because I do think that is a way, if you're going to try to have some across the aisle stuff, as you say, sort of, could you get back to some geographic, industry, whatever kind of ways in which you'd have a alignment across the aisle. So I think there are tactical things, but I think overall you also need to think about sort of what's the narrative upstairs, and I think we have to think about that as a way. And lastly, I'll say is I am dubious about the sort of going back and forward, whether we can go back to something. I'm not convinced that that's exactly the paradigm that I would use, right? I think it needs to be something, I don't think it will go back. I think it is something different. And the problem is you have to have a sort of a vision of what that difference is. Now, I've also been around Capitol Hill for like 20 years. It's like the institution that stays the institution. Like if you have a new lunch menu, that's like, oh my God, so there's, I think part of this is to understand the institution has its, like, clings to its thing. So I'm not suggesting something radical, Mike. I'm just saying that I think we have to think about it in a more expansive way.
Bill, you want to jump in?
I think Louisa's absolutely right. We're not going to find a way to go back to what we had. The textbook model is really very long gone. And none of us should really be very distressed by passing a CR in September, because that's what we do every single year. We can't pretend that it's somehow something we can't live with. We've lived with that as a practice for many years. But I think we need to take note that there is somebody with a different vision for how this should work, sitting as the director of the Office of Management and Budget right now. And his vision is that we can just go on passing continuing resolutions forever and let the Office of Management and Budget sort it out. That is a live possibility right now. We are already on a full year continuing resolution right now, and there is absolutely a caucus within the Republicans in the House who would just like to see that happen again, and Russ Vought has made it clear that he would like to see that happen again. So we're in danger of having the appropriations committees and Congress lose not only their sort of back in the good old days form of accommodationist deal-making power, we're in danger of them basically getting cut out of the formal process altogether. And I think just a few years ago that might have seemed unthinkable, and today it really doesn't seem unthinkable. So
I agree with that, Phil.
I think it's a very dangerous season.
You know, this textbook, I don't know if people know what Bill means by textbook Congress, but anybody who took a Congress class and as an undergraduate knows that this is when you had a strong committee system based on policy expertise. And it was the foundation of it was the seniority system, so members of Congress could develop their professional capacities. And that comes from the fact that with the development of an executive-centered administrative state, in a sense, the president and Congress switch constitutional positions. The president becomes decidedly the first mover, and so Congress passes the 1946 Legislative Reorganization Act, which establishes this strong committee system. And they're charged, it's almost biblical, they're charged with continuous watchfulness over the executive branch. And I think that oversight is extremely important and is still important. But the committee system is greatly weakened. I think you were there, Dan. No, I'm not blaming you. By the Gingrich rules. And then, but it was by Nancy Pelosi when she became Speaker in 2006. I think I had a typo in my essay. She bestowed bipartisan legitimacy on the centralization of power in Congress to the party leadership. I think there's a lot of value to that, but I think you're right, Louise. We shouldn't go back. Because this kind of left Congress as with the responsibility of participating in the details of administration, they lost their capacity and their vitality as a lawmaker, and therefore they became more distant from the public, particularly since it was based on the seniority rule.
Mike, can I jump in real quick?
Sure.
I agree we need to look forward, but I think we also need to address the real problem, which is, again, going back to Luis's point about political incentives. Congress, the House in particular, they run every 2 years. That's the way the Founding Fathers designed it. And if we don't address the political incentives and what, right now, and I think we may talk about this a little more, I expect we will, but right now, new members come to Congress not with the intention of trying to get things done and figure out how they can govern more on their terms than the other side's terms, which was the way it was. When the committee system broke, it did, there was more centralization of power. 28 years before I was McCarthy's chief of staff, I was Gingrich's chief of staff. But we did pass all the appropriations bills in 1996 separately. And the system worked, and he would preach to the Republicans when the Democrats would do, oppose in what ways they thought were outrageous. He said, look, he quoted a speaker from the 17th century who said, the purpose of the majority in Congress is to govern, and the purpose of the minority is to try to become the majority. And so it was like, tolerate the opposition. They have a right to do what they're going to do. And we've gotten to the point where there are so many forces in this. I think a lot of it is social media, where people now come in and they're not interested in trying to move the ball in their direction in governing. They're pandering to their followers on social media, and it becomes extremely hard to get things done because the House, at its substance, is a majoritarian institution. It's Senate to some degree, although it's 60 votes, but you can also have a lot more influence as a single member because of the rules of the Senate. In the House, you can't do anything without a majority. And so if you've got pockets if you're the majority in the House and you have pockets of folks who, our strategy is this, because I want to be able to be on TV or again, pander to my social media following, it's very hard to govern, which again, should be the purpose of trying to get the majority in the first place.
Part of this power shift from Congress to the president, Sid, you write, most troubling, Congress appears to have forfeited the all-important authority to declare war. Now, I know Senator Kaine is due here any moment now.
Here.
And he's been pushing for years for Congress to take back that authority and perform that duty. What happened?
I think we've had two stages of this. First is the Cold War, which creates a situation of where, with things like nuclear capacity, and fighting against communist proxies, the president demands more flexibility to take on the responsibility of the national security state, which is established in the late 1940s. And Harry Truman, and the first war where we don't have a declaration of war is the Korean War. In fact, Congress never acts at all because Truman justifies our Korean action on the basis of a UN resolution. And the UN treaty, he says, obligates us to interfere with Korea. And word goes out to the departments that the power to declare war is, and this is exact words, in abeyance, because Congress no longer declares war in advance. And in a press conference, Truman added to that debating national security issues in Congress, robust debate, is not a good thing for our position in the Cold War. The second thing I think that contributes to this is Homeland Security, which is a huge change. I don't think we talk, my colleague Phil Potter's here, he talks a lot about it quite a bit. This is a huge change because what this does, Homeland Security was hardly used as a term in American politics before 9/11.
Sure.
It's ubiquitous now, and what that does is extend presidential plenary power from foreign affairs to the homeland, and also engages the country in sort of perpetual war that doesn't involve wars very often against countries. We're fighting against an ideal, terrorism. There was some of that when we fought against communism, but there was the Soviet Union, there's China. There's China now, but it's not the same thing. So this constant state of war we're in now, as President George W. Bush said, requires preemptive action in the way that was not necessary before the demands of Homeland Security came on.
Bill?
Yeah, I would just add a little rider that I just don't, we go through this song and dance when we have the president deciding to bomb people, where the opposing party says, oh my gosh, can you believe he's doing this without coming to Congress first? But I don't really think anyone's heart is in it, to be honest. A lot of the sort of changes in the relative powers of Congress and the presidency are fully internalized in the minds of the legislators themselves. And I think this one is sort of long gone, and maybe it's sort of getting pushed to new places where, okay, maybe the president can't just decide to blow up anybody because it's in the national security interest. That seems troubling.
Certainly not 3 people in a speedboat in the Caribbean.
So, we're sort of testing out the limits of just how irrelevant Congress is willing to be. But the idea that they would ever become sort of the first mover again seems hard for me to fathom.
Yeah, the war power resolutions never work.
To be candid, after covering the Hill for a decade, I got the sense that a lot of members didn't want to take that vote. They saw the Iraq war vote weaponized against people who voted for the Iraq war, and maybe some of them, maybe I'm wrong, I'll defer to you guys, but I think some of them are happy to sit that out. Ann?
I mean, this is another example. Yesterday, the conversation mentioned tribalism in politics, and this is another example. In just what Bill's talking about. If the president of my party proposes it, I'll probably vote for it, but if it's the other party, boy, this is a horrible decision. How could this happen? and it, it's a sad commentary, but it's exactly what's going on.
I would just also say, I think the politics have shifted on my side of the aisle a little bit about this. Like, I think about how the kind of debates we were having about it, like in the first term in Obama versus now with Democrats. So I think that it's, I agree with Dan, like part of it is, if my guy's in power, how do I approach this? I also think, Sid makes a good point, this kind of merging between Homeland Security, law and order, and the war powers gets smushy sometimes, and that makes it harder, a little bit of our guys on our side. But I see more, I think there is probably a little bit more appetite on my side of the aisle if you were going to be voting for this kind of thing. I think it was harder in the Obama side. But again, I agree, I think, with both Phil and Dan, that it's become now just something you're doing to either give your guy a check or to be the minority party. And I think the other thing is, part of this is politics in that, you know, in campaigns, whether you're running a congressional campaign or you're running a presidential campaign, there are intermittent moments where national security and foreign policy have texture and feel and do something for your campaign, but lots of times really just not as how you voted on that is less and less becomes like a relevant way about how you're running a campaign. You know, again, I understand the Iraq War was a different place when we came in the Obama administration, but I do think that's part of the reason that, to your point, it's like, it's number 10 on my list. Like, it's just not number 1.
Right.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to add, one of the things we haven't talked about, it's not just, you don't just apply it on the war votes, but it's pretty much across the board, is the fact that there are, and they talked about this a little bit yesterday, that there are so few swing districts anymore.
Right.
That the election you have to worry about if you're an
Yeah.
incumbent member of Congress is
It's
your
just your
primary.
base, yeah.
So if you vote for a conflict, if you vote for George W. Bush's Iraq War, you might have an issue in a Democratic primary because somebody's going to, you know, run to your left. And likewise on the Republican side, they're always watching to see who's going to try to get to their right, and which, again,
Yeah.
makes governing, whether it's a war vote or any other type of governing, appropriations votes, very difficult.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Don't you guys think that Hillary Clinton not voted for the Iraq resolution, that she would have been much more successful in the 2008 primaries?
I mean,
Because Obama had the good fortune of not being
right,
in the
having to
Senate
do that.
yet.
I mean, I take your point. I take
I'm
your
just
point.
trying-
Yeah,
oh,
no. I take your point, Sid. I think obviously a lot of part of that presidential election was really a reaction to the war. So I don't think you're wrong on that. I guess I would just say that there are a confluence of reasons around that. So I'm not
Said like a
really-
true political
yeah,
scientist.
exactly. Thank you. I think I'm gonna veer on confluence here of why. But I do take your point. Obviously, sometimes we forget how live that was at the time, right? Looking back on it, sometimes it doesn't appear that
I
way.
was at the 2016 National Democratic Convention, and of course Bernie Sanders ran a very strong insurgent campaign, emphasizing quite a bit Hillary
Right.
Clinton. And the chant that went up, I thought I was back in the late 60s. It was no.
So it's like, yay, it's
no,
back.
all those, the Bernie supporters were yelling every time the Homeland, anytime the war on terror was mentioned, no more war, no more war. It was an echo of the Vietnam, anti-war Vietnam movement.
But it's interesting now, the politics, right, about sort of the no more war is coming from the other side of the aisle, about that isolationism that is really coming. It's just an interesting switch there. And that is part of the reason, Sid, I think on my side, it's a little bit more mixed up, right? Because how do we respond to a big part of this isolationism that's coming from the side of the Republicans?
Sort of isolation, neo-isolation.
Sorry, whatever, yes, whatever the proper academic term is, of course.
I'd like to pick up on a point that Dan touched on moments ago, which is I'm old enough to remember a time when newly elected members to Congress came to town, sat in the back of the room, listened, observed, and, you know, maybe the first couple of terms didn't really get talked too much. It was kind of like learn the ropes, and then as you get a little experience, we'll start to care about what you think. These days, folks come to Capitol Hill with 4 million social media followers, and they're celebrities in their own right, at least to a certain audience.
Where they want to be.
How difficult is that as a former McCarthy chief of staff to manage?
It's extraordinarily challenging. I'll give you a quick little anecdote. In the days past, I won't say the old days, but in the days past, it was often you'd come to Congress and your delegation, you'd meet with them and try to figure out, you know, and there's a story of a member who got elected in late, 2016, 2018, something like that, and they had a meeting of the Florida delegation. I'm not going to name this member's name.
But if name names?
But if you're, well, let's just say as a former McCarthy staffer, this is maybe your least favorite Republican member of Congress of all time.
Matt Gaetz?
Yeah, I wasn't going to name names,
Yeah.
and so the Florida Republicans meet together, and they said, okay, let's try to figure out how we want to help our freshmen get on the right committees that they want, that they need to be on. And, we've got this member who's on armed services, so we're not going to have another one of those. So, and it came to this freshman, and he said, I don't care what committee I'm on. I'm here to be on TV. And and this story got told in all the circles, like, can you believe this guy? And it turns out there's a lot more like that than we think. And he was maybe just more on the front edge of it. It's extraordinarily difficult for leadership when this sort of thing happens, because that's, if your purpose for coming to Congress is not to try to get things done, then the people who are responsible for getting things done have a much harder job. It's very simplistic.
I think an embellishment on that is also you're just running for Congress by running against Congress is not a new phenomenon.
Yeah.
It goes back a ways, but it gets kind of taken to a new level if we have lots of legislators who are basically spending a huge portion of their time telling whoever will listen to them that their colleagues are corrupt and the whole place is rotten, and even the ones in their own party, right? It's just hugely damaging to any ability to regenerate trust, as we were talking about such a difficult problem yesterday. And, you know, I hate to be the guy who gets so dramatic, but maybe I don't. You know, if you look at what happened in 1930s Germany, you had anti-system legislators come to dominate the legislature. People who were getting elected but saying the whole system stinks and I hate it and I would tear it down if I had a half a chance.
Yeah.
And I just feel like we have that growing sense on both sides of the aisle in this country. There are forces on both sides who are getting elected, but their whole message is, I'm not really going to participate in this awful process. I'm going to do everything I can to blow it up.
Can I just say two things that sort of for Phil and Dan? I think part of what Dan described and what we've witnessed is part of managing your caucus in this time. It is so hard. So part of I don't know what's the exact right verb, but the way in which leadership now relies on Trump right now in this era, and I'm sort of using it neutrally, part of this helps them. They don't have to control their caucus. It's a very convenient and almost their last ditch effort because you don't have anything else, right? You really, that's very helpful right now for Thune and for Johnson, right? For different reasons, but it controls this somehow when they have a lot of divergence amongst and the reasons why some people are in their caucus. So I would put that in the category sometimes where you see the deference that Congress is paying. Part of that is like, I got no choice because I cannot control the cats unless you have Trump in some ways. So I put that in that court. The other thing I will say is I have, I agree there's the anti-government kind of folks who are running, and part of it is a generational change. So I think some of this, we have to look at this with some level of positivity. I think, and that's a good thing, and that it's going to be slower in some pockets, but I do think that's an exciting part of this. The other thing I'd say is sustaining your brand as a disruptor and an outsider in Congress is actually hard. Right? There are some, one of my former boss, Senator Booker, came in at the time and he was like he knew how to use Twitter, and everyone's like, oh my God, Twitter. How do you do that thing, right? But I think there was nervousness of that Corey kind of came to this with so much heft and power outside of it. And if you look at how he's used that in his caucus to say, hey, learn how I'm using this, he's sort of become a leadership. Look at someone like AOC. I mean, she is incredibly talented of putting up her phone and spending an hour knitting and talking to people about what she's seeing and hearing. And I would argue she's much more of an institutionalist in some ways than when she first came to Congress. So I don't think all of this is like the end of creation by using social media, right? I'm not dismissing, I agree with Dan, I agree with Phil, but I just think the renegade piece of this, you think about how you sustain that. Even someone like Senator Fetterman, right? Like how he came in and how to use it and what do you do with it? It's just hard. So it's problematic for sure, but I do think we should need to, this is like chapter 1 of this, right? And we'll see how some of that evolves, I think.
I wonder how Louisa and Dan think about this, the relationship between the institution and the individual member. So the Congress has always been, people have always been skeptical of Congress as an institution. There's a quote from Mark Twain. where he says he's corrupt and he's a member of Congress, but I repeat myself. So that goes back to the 19th. But there has been this dynamic that scholars of Congress wrote about up through at least the 1980s, whereby people dislike Congress as an institution. I think in Alan Stam's essay, he says it's 11% right now, the favorability for Congress, but they like their congressperson better. I guess primaries have cut back on reelection possibilities. But still, most incumbents are still reelected. Do you think that still holds, that even though, because Congress is, it's set up to be the representative institution, not the administrative institution, not the adjudicating institution. It's really the cornerstone of a representative democracy. Is that still there?
I mean, I guess I think part of that is, I'm just not sure. Like, I think obviously if you look at, I think that more and more people are checking out of this entirely. And even if like Phil's my local guy and I like him and I went to high school with him and I'm going to still show up or give him money for his, those personal connections drive that. But if you look at this, even again, a presidential year is different than a midterm year clearly, but you just look at sort of the numbers and what it takes to sort of bring out voters again, I think that diminishment I think that's significant. Now we've seen crummy numbers for Congress like ever since like forever. So I'm not saying that's dynamic has changed, but I think this idea of a more, I call them like a fickle voter, right? I think we've had these interesting conversations that I've heard about independent voters, swing voters. How do we rethink of that, particularly in the wake of our most recent presidential? This kind of fickle voter to me feels like either you've grabbed them with the sale and you're going to like click on it and you're going to buy the shoes and buy the guy, or you're not, and it doesn't matter to you as much whether you've made that choice. To me, is that enduring? Is that just a product of where we were on 24 and all the messiness of that? But I'm not sure this kind of idea of an enduring value set about I want to vote for my guy and I still believe in that. I'm a little
Just
wary.
look how little resistance anybody has put up to all the gerrymandering stuff going on right now.
Right.
There's partisan resistance to it, to say, I don't want to lose this advantage. But how many people have actually articulated the principle of you are damaging the representative system here? Poor Adam Kiley Kevin Kiley of California, who's likely to lose his seat. He's the only one who's been making this argument.
It's an excellent. It's a really excellent example. I mean, I think the debate around the redistricting, the absence of that, is very telling. I agree with that.
I will just say, in response to that, and I think again the fact that there are so few purple districts it's been detrimental. Making a case to the body politic on electoral, like structural issues, I've never seen work.
Yeah, no one. I don't.
People care about what's going on, like
right then
in their lives, and it's kind of, that's interesting, but it's not something that I'm still going to. You'd think that would, but I don't think that's something that they put top and center when they're going to the voting booth. It is interesting to me. The conversation yesterday mentioned that we had some of the highest turnouts we've had in recent history. I think Doug Sosnick was mentioning that at lunch yesterday in the 2020 and 2024 elections, which, I mean, people understand that there's a lot at stake. It's just that they're very polarized. And so it's, like we talked about tribalism, it's difficult to bring folks together, although I do see some swings back and forth. The dynamics, my side, a lot of the Freedom Caucus people who are tended to be the most difficult to try to manage. A lot of them are leaving Congress. Yeah. And so they.
But don't you attribute, like, I look at those guys sort of leaving Congress, Dan, in some of the same ways that some of the moderates that had to leave after some of the negotiations we did during the Biden administration, right? Like, there seems to be, like, if there's no room for me to do these things anymore, I'm going to go.
Right.
So whether that's Freedom Caucus or whether it's Senator Portman, to me, they're of the same. Some of the rationale sort of the same. So, not entirely, but some of the strands. Like, it's too hard to do this in this place.
I mean, before I can be completely encouraged by an increase in turnout. I want to look at what happens in midterm elections.
Yeah.
There's one thing that happens with a modern presidency, which wasn't there until its existence, there's a great drop-off in congressional election, quite a difference between people who turn out for a presidential and congressional.
Right.
I believe there was a slight surge in 2022, but it wasn't much.
I don't know.
And
As
how
McCarthy's
many
chief, that
Americans don't
surge
even-
wasn't quite high enough.
Yeah,
All
yeah.
right. No, it was a huge surge. What are you talking about? It was a wave, Sid. It was huge. Come on.
There wasn't a red wave.
So after Congress has given up power to the executive branch, now when the president uses the power, there are folks on Capitol Hill who get frustrated like, hey, wait a minute. And so then they turn to the courts. So how do the courts react when Congress doesn't really put up a fight? You want to lead off, Sid?
Well, sometimes they react very strongly. Now there's this new doctrine. I think it's new. Barbara Perry can tell me if I'm wrong. The important questions doctrine. Major thing. I don't know why I always say important. I think that's a hopeful major questions doctrine. And this was front and center in the court's overturning of President Biden's debt relief executive orders, which was based on the HEROES Act on dubious legal ground. The burning question now, because the courts have, and this is important because the courts have come to be viewed as more partisan, particularly after the reproductive rights case, the Dobbs decision. Will they apply this this major questions doctrine? By the end of this panel, I'll get it right. The major questions doctrine to the tariffs. Will they take on this? Let's see if I can remember the international. Yeah, I don't use. I learned yesterday you're not supposed to use.
No acronyms.
No acronym. International Emergency Economic Powers Act. There we go. It doesn't even mention tariffs. It's a very dubious legal position for the president to take. So will they take that on? Will they use the major questions doctrine in overturning that law? If they don't, then the question becomes, well, are you really? Do you really have the blindfolds on when you're administering? Justin, they could say, well, this involves national security in some way. We're not. I think the deeper problem, if the court's since Congress is not acting, if the court's constantly getting involved, I think that's dangerous for the courts. And I think it's dangerous for democracy. And just to quote Lincoln briefly in his criticism of the Dred Scott decision, he said, if the courts come to decide foundational issues like slavery, then we've sacrificed self-government to an eminent tribunal. And I think if we rely on the courts to save our republic, there's a real question about whether we have a republic.
Bill?
I totally agree. I think it's just such a pervasive habit in Congress to hope that the courts relieve us of having to sort through these difficult issues, right? When Biden did the student debt relief, there was a lot of anxieties about whether it might run into problems in court. But you had people arguing strategically that might be a good thing for us anyway. Yeah. Then we can rail against those awful conservative judges who took away debt relief from you. And on the tariff stuff, I think there's actually quite a lot of dissension in the Republican Party about whether these tariffs are a good thing or a bad thing substantively, and certainly a lot of discomfort about the process that's brought them about and the infinite flexibility that the president says he has with them. But they're just waiting. They're hoping that the Supreme Court bails them out so they don't have to have a fight that rends their party. That's a bad habit.
Yeah, I would just add, to the extent that Congress has deferred to the president or can't get things done, so the presidents have seized the moment in utilizing executive orders. The courts, the way our system is designed, the way the founders designed it, they may not like it, but they do need to step up and do their jobs. They don't have 2-year terms. They have lifetime appointments, and so they have to take on these tough things. And maybe it's lack of courage on the part of Congress that they won't deal with it. But I do think if they do their jobs, and like the student debt thing, if presidents are exceeding their authority with their executive orders, and this is going to be discussed in the next session in more detail.
Nice producing.
And the courts do the right thing if, in those circumstances, and strike them down. And then Congress, if you want that policy, there's one way to get it done, is actually go back to getting it done through Congress. And so, again, I tend to be the pendulum swings back and forth in politics, and we are definitely in a period where people are pushing the envelope on executive authority. But at some point, I'm hopeful that it goes back, because it has to if you want these policies.
I guess I would just add, I don't disagree with what they're saying. I do think we are in an unusual time because of the sheer volume and diversity of issues that are now in front of the Supreme Court, right? Like, it was one thing if you were challenging, our student debt, but this is a whole swath of things, whether you're talking about tariffs, whether you're talking about how the government functions around Homeland Security. I mean, it is
14th Amendment.
14th, I mean, you're looking at so much here. So to me, that changes, it adds like a different kind of element in these times. I would argue, yes, if the court should be, I would like the court to see Congress fighting in different ways as much as they can. So yes, I think that matters. But I do think here we're in an unusual position where there's just the sheer scope of this and kind of what that means. And I think that this, I mean, Lord knows there's a whole industry of very, very smart lawyers sort of watching and predicting and know the Supreme Court so well. That is not my camp. But I will say this, I think the position that Roberts Court in is incredibly difficult. Like, this idea is like, where is the line going to be drawn? How they do that? What are the zones that they say, yes, this is, whether it's around the firings, that has been something where the court seems to have signaled to give the president those kind of powers that he's exercising. So to me, that this feels very dicey to me. And this question of, it feels all the time that we're on this tipping point. What is too much for the court? What is too much? When have we gone across the line? I think this is a constant question of where we are in this. When is a sort of point of no return? And I think that's very hard in these politics to have the court be the person, the entity that is deciding so much of that. And the timing is hard. I mean, and you have a whole electorate. Like, I'm a lawyer, and there's like 140 something cases, and where they decided, and what appellate courts, and what. I mean, I don't even know all that stuff. If we expect like my mom to do it, again, my mom's lovely and smart.
Yes.
I don't think.
Granted.
How do you do that, right? So I just think as a moment in time and how you're managing the politics and the value set of this, very, very hard, and we should acknowledge that it's has some abnormality to it.
We've been challenged to come up with solutions, not just talk problems, solutions.
I've got to go get some coffee.
All right. Do we have solutions for fixing the imbalance of power between the executive branch and the legislative branch? Thoughts?
Sid?
I was going to say Dan.
I knew this was coming my
I know.
way.
Go, Dan.
Best defense is a good offense.
This is going to sound very abstract, but I've been arguing for like 3 decades that Americans had to disenthrall themselves from their dependence in the presidency. That I don't see how you, a country of over 300, a diverse country of 300 million, over 300 million people, can invest so much faith, so much power in one individual, and still say they're doing something like Jefferson called self-government. It just seems to me to be a very, very mischievous. I understand how it developed as problems grew in the nation, and we needed the president to take on more problems. We saw 2 fantastic examples of that last night. But when it becomes a constant thing, when it's a routine thing, when people in Congress leave it to Stephen Miller to do immigration policy, and they do photo ops at the border, that is a very, very dangerous thing. And one of the odd things is that the American people have presidential amnesia. So when, like Bill shows some graphs that the American public is worried about presidential power, but Dan and Louisa alluded to this with respect to Congress. When a Democrat's in the White House, Democrats don't worry about it. When a Republican's in a White House, then Republicans don't worry about it. So we have this odd situation where the American people look to the presidency to be their savior. And with President Trump, this has almost become literal. But half the country hates the president. And I think that's a formula that's very, very dangerous. Is that your cell phone?
Better not be. Nope, not me. So Dan,
Tell President Trump I'm sorry.
does it require a powerful speaker or somebody like that? You served under Gingrich. We've seen Nancy Pelosi on the other side. Powerful speakers. Is it going to take something like that to say we're taking back some of our authority, some of our power?
Well, I mean, first of all, you can't apply a blanket statement. Circumstances change. Nancy Pelosi was a powerful speaker when she had Democratic majorities. She also, I mean, she did very well working with President Bush. Didn't work so well with President Trump, different types of people. How big's your majority? That makes a big difference. Right now, the margins are very narrow. I will give her credit. She was able to manage her caucus with a narrow majority better than Republicans have been in terms of having unity. I would make 2 points about where this goes in the future. And the point was made yesterday. I think Chris Liddell said, performance matters. And the conversation yesterday about faith in government is a function of performance, and I absolutely agree with that. Where I'm a little more pessimistic is the opportunity to show some sort of a unified performance. It normally only comes when there's a real crisis, and going back to Luis's point about political incentives, where the incentive is on a bipartisan basis, we need to solve this problem, is more important than our tribalism. That happened, and I saw that up front. I was George W. Bush's head of legislative affairs when we had the financial crisis, and the leadership and the key players on the Hill all felt we need to solve this. We need to solve it fast. Yeah. And we did. I mean, from the meetings that Bernanke and Paulson had with the president, and then that night we set up a meeting with the congressional leadership. To when the bill was signed into law was 15 days. And people, you don't get credit. We avoided a problem, and so. Everybody hates the solution on that one. But that's my point is a crisis will drive, in my mind, it almost takes that to prove that government can function, and it's because they're afraid of the consequences of the crisis is when it functions. And that is a pessimistic view, but it gives us a chance for performance and maybe provide some more faith in government.
Yeah. I mean, Dan and I talked about this yesterday. I do agree that you can have kind of a catalyst for coming together, and it could be something that is sort of outside, bigger, requires that kind of cohesion. Now, you do have to have a shared value and fact set on what that crisis is, right? So even somehow the way that how we responded to COVID, as you've seen, people sort of saw it and experienced it differently and had different ideas. And so sometimes it was a way we came together, and sometimes it wasn't. So I agree with Dan, but we really have to think about what that kind of catalyst would be. I look at a couple things. I think certainly we have to also remember unified government is like your bank shot, right? And this is your time to drive. And I'm not saying, I think certainly from my side, I can sit here all day about things that I think are super troubling and out of the norm. I have a very specific viewpoint, but nonetheless, you have to give credit where credit is due. When you have unified government, you got to go fast, hard, and you got to lead. And part of what you want when you're president is, look, fellas and gals, like, get in line. This is what we're doing. This is the only time we're going to do it. Trust me, go. You got to be part of the team. We wanted that, right? We wanted it when we came in with Obama. We certainly came in when I was with Biden. So some of that is going to, ebb and flow when you come up to 26, where I think, we're going to have a great wave, but whatever. I think part of this...
Mark the tape.
Yeah, mark the tape. I'm going to go out there. I'm going to stand by this. I feel very comfortable with that. So some of this is going to see some ebb and flow that you're going to come back in 26, right? And you're going to be back in divided government. That's going to be some of this. I will say what we haven't talked about, and because I'm kind of a Senate girl at heart, I do think it's interesting in this time when you look at the way the Senate has behaved, particularly around nominations and blue slip. A lot of pressure on them to either get rid of the blue slip, which is a way that they do regional, how they figure out judges. But they held on to blue slip, and there was pressure on them to do recess appointments. They didn't. Now they changed the rules, like we can talk about that. But I do think there have been some ways where the Senate, to me, there's some protective piece about that, about their power, and I think it's an interesting way they've kind of held onto that around the nominees. So to me, there is some of that. And then the last thing I'll say, and I think Doug Sosnick said this yesterday, and I'm sad to say, like, I'm kind of the people that have to die off, but I do think this kind of generational change and the excitement about how do you kind of harness a different kind of politics, about how you communicate with voters, like, I think that is coming. And that could have some of the ways in which you'd have some renewed energy and understanding about like how government can work together. And you're going to see cross things about the efficiencies and the performance, like this abundance debate, right? It's bringing people from some different places around how you actually effectuate government. And so I'm sort of doomsday a little bit, but then I have moments of like the kids are going to save us. I'm just going to say.
Phil, solution, go.
I'll just voice some skepticism about the unified government as a solution, because look where your Inflation Reduction Act is today. It's largely rolled back. If we
But that was bipartisan, Phil. I mean, part of that, like,
Not the inflation.
No.
Sorry.
I feel like this
reconciliation.
trend of trying to do everything through unified government, which we are relying on much more for the sort of important enactments in the 21st century, just leaves us liable to going back and forth whenever the wind changes. It's not a way of working through our problems and settling it. So I'm with Sid. Unfortunately, I do believe that the only long-term hope for self-government is to disenthrall people from the presidency, and gosh, that is
That is
hard,
not gonna be easy,
hard
yeah.
work. You have to actually build up Congress as something appealing and attractive, people who have a different vision and are willing to stand up for it and make it appealing to the American people, quite apart from any ambitions on the presidency. And that's hard work. I don't know where we even start. I wrote a book 2 years ago. Why Congress? Please, available for purchase.
Panelists, great job. Many thanks.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
Thanks, Frank. Thank you.